Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Political Science we will be looking into India-China relations in 21st century. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Delhi University. He has over 25 years of teaching experience and he is a prolific teacher. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you, Amrit. And good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on India-China relationship. A relationship which is shrouded in a lot of controversies and lot of debates and discussions over the years. But in spite of so many areas of differences and disputes, this relationship that is between India and China is entering into new phase in 21st century. So much so that the entire world is having their attention fixed on these two countries which are considered to be powerhouse of development. In fact, many scholars have started arguing that 21st century belongs to Asia and India and China are perhaps the major player so far as this Asian resurgence in 21st century is concerned. Therefore, this relationship acquires a lot of significance from the point of view of both Asian perspective as well as from the perspective of the global politics. Now, in order to understand this relationship in a more holistic perspective, what is required that we should have a look at this relationship in phases. In fact, the first aspect of this relationship is the civilizational linkage between China and India. In fact, it will not be off the mark to say that in today's world there are very few countries which are both nation state and civilizational state, and China and India basically qualify to be called a civilization state along with this nation state, because in name of civilization there are very few countries which are left today. Of course, Greece is there, but Greece is no longer a very important player in world politics. All other civilizations have perished and only India and China perhaps remain on the political and geographical horizon. So therefore, that adds a lot of significance to these two countries so far as their position and their stature in international politics is concerned. Apart from that, in fact these countries are neighbors. They share common boundary. They in fact have had civilizational linkages in terms of cultural exchange of knowledge, in terms of many other linkages which in fact go back in history. For example, Buddhism, which originated in India, traveled to China and many far eastern countries, and not only that, in fact many centuries ago, particularly in ancient time, those who were aspiring to learn the knowledge system, the ancient Indian knowledge system, those who were basically interested in learning Buddhism, the Buddhist philosophy, different aspects of knowledge, they used to travel to India and took education in two ancient universities, that was Nalanda and Bikramshila. In fact, Nalanda has been resurrected in recent years in order to create that old linkages, civilizational linkages between among the Asian countries. So therefore, that type of cultural exchange these two countries had. In fact, we can also say that some of the historical reconstruction which is done in India about its ancient history is also based on the kind of writings which were handed down by some travelers, Chinese travelers who visited India, Wansa and Fayan and many other Chinese travelers who came to India, and they left a very invaluable account about India's society, India's culture, Indian condition at that time. So therefore, that shows that how closely these two countries were linked with each other. But after with the advent of modern period, when India was subjected to British imperialism, China that way was not, but nonetheless it was also it also lost its freedom and autonomy in a different way, and therefore both countries suffered in terms of their glory. But this 20th century, when both India and China got their independence, and immediately in China after that nationalist uprising and upsurge or nationalist government, it was basically replaced by a communist revolution in 1949, whereas India in 1947 witnessed a freedom movement and freedom struggle and attainment of independence from the colonial rule. So therefore it was a new beginning for these two ancient societies, two ancient countries who, as I mentioned, were the civilization in terms of their past heritage. So that was the new beginning. But the beginning, interestingly, was got basically marred into a lot of controversies. The fact of the matter is that India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, in fact was the first one to recognize China after 1949 revolution. Apart from Burma, no other non-communist regime had recognized China, and India went ahead and gave recognition. Not only that, India under Nehru also supported India, China's claim for membership of Security Council as a successor of the nationalist regime in China, Kuomintang, and therefore what we find that India went all the way to basically support China's case on the global stage. So that is one. Apart from that, in 1947, when Asian Relations Conference was held in Delhi, and Nehru at that time, when he basically presented a vision for 20th century, he specifically mentioned that this 20th century, the Asian countries have to play important role because many of them have come out of their colonial yoke, and therefore they have to forge closer ties in order to create a new world, a democratic world and a peaceful world. So therefore, in fact, this was the beginning, and that bonhomie continued for some time, and so much so that 1954 Nehru visited China, and the kind of welcome which was given to Nehru was basically astounding, because millions of, thousands and thousands of lakhs and lakhs of people basically lined up to welcome India's Prime Minister. Now, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, when he visited India in 1954, similar welcome was accorded to him. So that was the kind of exchange of dignitaries and leaders, and the kind of bonhomie which I mentioned continued. But it was short-lived, and immediately we find that two countries got locked into fierce war of words, verbal duel, and resulting into that 1962 aggression, which is basically known in India not as war but a Chinese aggression, because the China not only invaded but also unilaterally also declared ceasefire later and retreated, but nonetheless was an aggression in 1962, and this aggression was basically ostensibly on the issue of border dispute. We will basically take up this issue, that how this border controversy, how border dispute stands between India and China. Though India has border with many countries, but there are few neighbors with which border has been a very problematic thing for India, and border with China is one such border. For example, this McMahon line, because China refuses to recognize McMahon line, saying it is an imperialist line. It was drawn by the imperialist power, and therefore China's claim on certain territories in India, which is contested by India, saying that China never had in past any claim on those territories which it claims to be its own. So therefore that basically is the basis for this border dispute. But then there are certain other areas of concern and other areas of dispute, and we will basically look at those areas before we move to this 21st century, which is the beginning of the new chapter, the new engagement, largely on account of certain new developments. And one of the most important development has been this economic reforms and economic growth in two countries. So much so that the entire world community today recognizes India and China as the two fastest growing economies in the world. In terms of market, these two countries are considered to be the biggest market. And in terms of their power, because ultimately in international politics it is the economic power which basically becomes the lever for other forms of power, and therefore, these two countries are slated to be the most important power in the world politics by 2050. So, this is one part of this story, that is the 21st century, how these two countries are placed in terms of this power dynamics. But before that, we have to look at some of the issues which have been the bone of contention between India and China. And I was mentioning one such area has been, apart from border, has been the Tibet, the question of Tibet. In fact, Tibet is a kind of cultural zone within China, which has had traditional cultural linkages with India. In fact, Buddhism, which is perhaps those who live in Tibet practice Buddhism, and Buddhism not only originated in India, but has had a kind of cultural and philosophical linkage with Indian society, Indian civilization. And apart from that, in terms of geographical proximity also, Tibet has always been considered a very close affinity, with shared close affinity with Indian people, Indian society. So, that is one thing. But what happened that when after revolution, China's, this Tibet's autonomy became a kind of controversial issue within the Chinese system, because Chinese constitution on the one hand recognized Tibet as autonomous province within one China policy, that there is one China, and within that one China, Tibet enjoys special status, a kind of autonomous status, kind of autonomy which is normally granted to cultural minorities on basis of cultural difference and on basis of similar other considerations. So, therefore, this was the constitutional position in China. But what happened in 1950, Chinese decided to basically scrap this autonomy and invaded Tibet. And this invasion came as a kind of surprise and shock for many countries in the Asia and South Asia, particularly in India, because India didn't imagine China to basically set out on this this adventurism so far as culture, Tibet was concerned. India didn't have any problem with one China policy, and India simply expected that China would respect its own constitution, which guarantees a special cultural autonomy to Tibet, cultural and political autonomy to Tibet within its broad constitution and within its sovereignty. But that didn't happen. In fact, India, of course, in spite of that 1950 invasion, got reconciled to this fait accompli. But therefore, in 1954, when Zhou Enlai visited India and an agreement was signed on border trade between India and China, it recognized the sovereignty of China on Tibet. India didn't question it, because as I mentioned that India didn't have any problem with one China policy, but only thing that it expected China to respect and honor this autonomous character of this region, that is Tibet, because of the kind of sentiment which was attached with the Tibetan people, Tibetan culture, who practiced and believed Buddhism, and a peaceful, peace-loving culture and peace-loving people. So that was the issue. But 1954, when Zhou Enlai came, this agreement was signed between India and China on border trade, which recognized one China policy and also recognized the sovereignty of China and Tibet as integral part of China. In fact, when this Panchashil doctrine was signed between India and China, which became a very important document so far as international politics is concerned, because apart from non-alignment, Panchashil can be considered as another doctrine to practice soft power in world politics, particularly from the point of view of peace and democracy. So therefore, this Panchashil also incorporated, which basically was the fallout of this agreement in 1954. This also talked of non-interference in each other's affairs and recognition of integrity and unity, and therefore that basically implied that India recognized Tibet and the Chinese basically invasion or Chinese intrusion or Chinese occupation of Tibet in 1950. So that was that is one part of the story. But what happened, that didn't basically resolve all the problems which were simmering there, and gradually we find that a kind of uprising took place in Tibet, and that uprising led finally in 1959 for Dalai Lama to basically flee from Tibet and seeking political asylum in India, which was granted, and that is the Dharmashala in Himachal Pradesh, where a lot of refugees from Tibet fled and settled, and therefore this development became a new bone of contention between India and China. That Dalai Lama coming to India, taking political asylum, settling in Dharmashala, creating a kind of government in exile on pattern of Lhasa. This area was rechristened as Lhasa, as if the capital of Tibet. So therefore, China thought that it was an interference in its internal affairs, but India simply tried to respect the sensibility and sentiments of the Indian people who were closely attached with the culture and the cultural values of the Tibet. Though, as I mentioned, that India respected China's sovereignty and China's one China policy. So this is one issue which started in 1950s and has continued till now, but the fact of the matter is that both China and India have over the years learned to respect each other's integrity and sovereignty in spite of pending border differences and disputes. But 1950s became a flashpoint between India and China. Then another issue which came up along with this Tibet was the border dispute. And as I mentioned, that China refused to basically accept McMahon Line as sacrosanct and called it an imperialist line, and claimed certain areas, certain territories in three sectors: Eastern, Middle and Western. And on all three sectors it claimed that Chinese territories basically were demarcated or basically shown by the Britishers as the part of India, but China had a claim on those territories, which was not acceptable to India. In fact, what happened that in 1957, China decided to complete a road across Akshay Chin in western sector, and that was also, in India's opinion, was improper. In fact, what happened that in 1960, it is believed that Zhou Enlai, when he met Nehru in London, he in fact made mention of this issue, that how China claimed certain territories which belonged to India as per Indian understanding. So therefore, this border issue was simmering between India and China. But what happened that by 1961-1962, this entire issue reached a flashpoint, and therefore we find that 1962, this Chinese aggression came as a shocker to India and India's first Prime Minister Nehru. And it is normally argued that Nehru was so much shattered and devastated by this development that he couldn't survive for long. And 1964 he died, because he never thought, even in the wildest of his dream, that Asian neighbor like China would ever invade India. And this invasion, in spite of the fact that, as I mentioned, Nehru went all the way to recognize, not only recognize China, but also supported China's case in United Nations Security Council for membership, permanent membership, as a successor of the earlier Chinese regime. So therefore, we find that this 62 became the turning point in India-China relationship. The kind of bonhomie which I mentioned started with India's independence and Chinese Communist Revolution in 1959, became short-lived, and immediately this entire thing resulted into this 1962 adventurism, Chinese adventurism, which is normally known as Chinese aggression. And therefore, after 1962, we find that all diplomatic contacts, all diplomatic channels of communication got stripped. In fact, there was no diplomatic engagement between these two countries till 1976, when during Mrs. Indira Gandhi's tenure, for the first time, ambassadorial contacts were established, and India appointed this ambassador in China, and thereafter China also reciprocated and appointed its ambassador in India. But after 1976, we find that there has been a slow and steady improvement in this relationship to the extent that today in 21st century we can find that India and China find themselves on the same page so far as many global issues are concerned, whether it is on the question of environment and ecology, whether it is question of development, whether it is question of trade negotiations in WTO as we saw in Doha round, or we can see number of multilateral forums where they share the high table along with some other countries, for example BRICS, and Shanghai Cooperation Shanghai Cooperation Organization SCO. So, I mean these forums where both China and India are members, even in G20. In fact, when 2008 there was economic crisis world over, in fact entire world community was looking at India and China as two important player in today's global situation to basically rescue this global economy from its crisis. So, therefore, what we find that after 1976, as I mentioned, that 62 aggression led to this scrapping of all ties, and 76 this restoration started, and after 76 we find that there has been a gradual and slow but gradual growth of engagement between these two countries, and we can find number of developments. The most significant development of course was 1988 visit of India's Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to China, and that happened after Nehru. So, one can imagine that after India's first Prime Minister, who not only wanted to forge closer ties with China, but visited China, supported China on many forums. In fact, the kind of disappointment which came here was basically gradually recovered only after India's Prime Minister 1988 Rajiv Gandhi visited China, when China also had witnessed many changes, and the most significant change was of course the ascendancy of a new leader in China, that is Deng Xiaoping. After that cultural revolution experience in China, the Mao China, China had also entered into new phase, a new leader who basically initiated reforms in economy in India. Of course, unlike Soviet Union, China as a communist country didn't initiate political and economic reforms simultaneously. Rather, it only went for economic reforms. As all of us know that in Soviet Union, when Gorbachev started Glasnost and Perestroika, both political and economic reforms, and ultimately that led also to the disintegration of Soviet Union. But the communist China, under new leadership, that is Deng Xiaoping, started economic reforms in 78. And gradually we find that economic reforms started picking up, and that basically transformed China into the powerhouse of development. And when 1988 Rajiv Gandhi visited China, India had not set out on that reform politics, which India did after 3 years, that is 1991. So, therefore, when today we talk of India China in 21st century, we have a different image and different basically picture of these two economies and two polities. Of course, India has been a democratic country from the very beginning, but so far as India's developmental strategy is concerned, India was a planned economic development story. India had a kind of developmental strategy which was very similar to some of the socialist countries in the world, and therefore, the kind of changes which were initiated in India in 1991, which is known as liberalization, which is known as economic reforms, which is known as liberalization, privatization and globalization, LPG, and that basically was 1991 onwards. But when China started reforms, that was not the period of globalization, but nonetheless China decided to open up its economy. China changed its strategy. In fact, when India was practicing from 1950 onwards import substitution strategy, China in fact based its entire strategy on export promotion, export based growth. So, therefore, they had two different strategies. From the period China set out on this new path. So, 1988 is very important. Rajiv Gandhi, India's Prime Minister, visits China. And therefore, what we find that the kind of diplomatic contacts which were established in 76 during his mother, Mrs. Indira Gandhi's tenure, in 1988 there were certain other developments which happened during that trip of Rajiv Gandhi, and the most important one was this appointment of the Joint Working Group JWG to deal with this border dispute between India and China. And since 1988, we can say this engagement has been growing, and this engagement has been taking many forms in spite of those pending disputes, in spite of Tibet, in spite of border dispute, in spite of many conflicting concerns, in spite of having Pakistan as a card between India-China relationship, in spite of having United States being a card in India-China relationship, this relationship is growing, and in 21st century can see that they are maturing to a new level, so much so that entire world is basically considering this relationship important for the world politics. Thank you. This China-India relationship in 21st century is basically becoming a theme for interest and kind of discussion in the world politics, which earlier in fact these two countries didn't have, because of a very simple reason that as per the assessment of World Bank, as per assessment of IMF, as per assessment of all international rating agencies, these two economies are heading for a major growth in 21st century. In fact, for many scholars and many analysts, many economists, in fact, though 21st century belongs to Asia, but within Asia, these two countries are going to play most important role. But there are other, there are few issues here which are also equally important. They are going to be important, but their relationship is equally important. How they manage their relationship, how they manage their diplomatic engagement, because there is no getting away from the fact that there are certain areas of differences and disputes between India and China, and two areas as we discussed, are basically Tibet and the border dispute. And there is no denying the fact that on Tibet, India stands by its old stated policy, that is one China policy, but at the same time recognition of Tibet as an autonomous province within China. And India expects China to honor its constitutional commitment. On border, India expects China to honor McMahon Line, though as I was mentioning that there are three sectors in which this border is spread with China. eastern, middle and western. In eastern sector, the area, the northeastern state of Arunachal Pradesh is perhaps the area which is under dispute between India and China from the China's point of view. Though India considered Arunachal to be the integral part of India, so much so that India also upgraded Arunachal as a full-fledged state, and that was of course opposed by China. In fact, China even opposed presentation of Arunachal's folk dance in 1982 Asiad games in Delhi. In China hardly loses any opportunity to oppose any act on the part of India so far as northeastern state of Arunachal is concerned, whether it is the visit of Dalai Lama or the visit of India's Prime Minister. And Dalai Lama one can understand because he is having a political asylum in India. But one doesn't understand that how China can justify opposition to India's Prime Minister visit to Arunachal Pradesh, because Arunachal is a state within Indian federal system. Indian political process extends to Arunachal Pradesh, but the fact of the matter is because China doesn't recognize McMahon line in Arunachal Pradesh, therefore believes that Arunachal is a disputed area, particularly one part of Arunachal which is basically a settled part where people live, mostly the Buddhists, and therefore this is one area of dispute. The other is the western sector, that is Akshay Chin. Basically this is the area which in 1962 China basically occupied some parts of Akshay Chin. So that is one. The second, and the third is the middle sector, that is Himachal. The fact of the matter is that China was even not ready to recognize Sikkim as integral part of India. When Sikkim was given a statehood, that was also opposed by China, but gradually came around the view and recognized Sikkim as integral part of India. And gradually we see that how this Nathula Pass route was opened for trade between India and China after series of visits by the dignitaries and the leaders from the both sides. So this is something there. Now, if we go by the analysis and observations of experts on India-China relationship, they believe that China is mainly interested in a western sector and trying to use eastern sector as a bargaining chip. Because its main interest is in Akshay Chin, because Akshay Chin is a kind of linking corridor between Tibet and certain other provinces of China, and Arunachal it is using as a bargaining chip to pressurize India to concede in western sector. In fact, even some accounts, historical accounts say that in 1954 Chow En-lai also alluded to it or hinted some sort of this swap between east and west, but it was not accepted, or it was not reciprocated by Nehru, because Nehru didn't consider this to a viable solution, because Nehru believed that India's claim, Chinese claim both in east and west were totally unjustified and unfounded. So this is the situation of a border dispute, but we will see that how this dispute is under negotiation, how this border problem both countries are trying to sort out through diplomatic negotiations. And that's why I mentioned that 1988 when Rajiv Gandhi visited, joint working group was created, and that was a very important development on border. Later on we find that special representatives were appointed to deal with this border dispute, and recently in 2005 we have seen that political parameters have evolved to deal with this issue through negotiation. So there is a gradual evolution of this policy after this creation of joint working group. In fact, we should also remember that before 1988 and after 1976 when diplomatic channel was established, in fact Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who was foreign minister in 1977, Morarji Desai Janata Party government decided to visit China, because Vajpayee was trying, as a foreign minister, was trying to normalize relation with some of its neighbors, some of India's neighbors, including Pakistan. And as part of that move, he visited China. But unfortunately, that visit resulted into a kind of tragedy, because China invaded Vietnam and without informing India, and therefore Vajpayee had to immediately return, and that visit didn't result into any significant development or any significant gains. But after Vajpayee's visit, of course, this 1988 Rajiv Gandhi's visit was quite significant. But 1988 visit is also significant from another point of view, because 1986 India and China had come very close to a border confrontation, reminiscent of 1962, and this is remembered as Sam-Dorung Chu Valley adventurism or confrontation in 1986. But these skirmishes didn't result into 62 type conflict, and therefore immediately closed on the heels when 1988 Rajiv Gandhi visited. That basically turned the tide, and after 88 we don't find that there has been any looking back so far as this improvement or improving this relationship is concerned. After 1988 we find that in 1991 Lai Peng came to India. 1992 Venkat Raman as President of India visited China. 1993 Narasimha Rao as the Prime Minister visited China, and then 1996 again the Chinese Premier Jamin came to India, and 2003 Vajpayee as India's Prime Minister visit happened, and then since then we have seen that number of visits. 2005, and then recently a few years ago again the Chinese Premier came here, and so this way we can see that this exchange has been going on regular basis so far as the high level political leadership is concerned. Apart from that, India and China now are part of many multilateral forums, and some of those forums are quite significant from the point of view of today's global economy. One is G20, another is BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and another is RICS, Russia, India, China. Then you have SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So therefore, we can see that how India and China find place on the high table of global negotiations so far as global economy is concerned. Now what happened that over the years, as I was mentioning, that there are engagement is taking place at different levels, at the levels of global economic diplomacy, on the level of bilateral trade, at the level of number of security dialogues, because earlier India and China didn't have any engagement so far as security dialogue is concerned. But we also find that recent years both countries are engaging each other in security dialogue, and even if initially the dialogue started, China was reluctant to enter into any dialogue on the nuclear issues, because China was not ready to recognize India as a de facto nuclear power, because India as not a signatory to NPT and still having a nuclear capability didn't go down well with China. And therefore, in 1998 after Pokhran II, when India came under sanction from most of the Western powers, China was also quick to do that. And immediately after 98 Pokhran, when Clinton, American president, visited China, and in fact in his speech requested China to take the responsibility of the security of Asia, that was the kind of new beginning in this US-China relationship. But as you will see later, it was short-lived, and immediately USA realized the importance of India from the point of view of both global politics as well as from the point of view of geostrategic calculation in Asia. So therefore, what we find that 1908 onwards, after Pokhran II, when sanctions were imposed, China was, along with other Western countries, were on the same page, and it wanted India to be isolated in this global community. But gradually we find that the Western powers came around the view that India's role in nuclear non-proliferation is important. Therefore, instead of isolating India, it is better to take India on board and thereby push this agenda of non-proliferation in the world. And it was around that time that we find that not only sanctions were lifted by the Western powers, but this 2005 civil nuclear deal between India and US was basically a game changer. And subsequently, when nuclear supplier group gave waiver to India for nuclear trade and commerce, that was another milestone so far as India's diplomacy is concerned. But China was uncomfortable on all these issues. So much so that recently, when most of the members of nuclear supplier group, they are keen to accept India as a member of this body, but China is basically, recalcitrant. It is, opposing on a different basis. It is saying that China is not opposing India, but it wants certain principles to be evolved on basis of which new members to be inducted. In fact, as the grapevine is, as the media reports, that China wants that along with India, Pakistan should also be inducted in NSG. But the problem with that, Pakistan's track record in terms of proliferation is not as clean as India, and therefore all other members of nuclear supplier group are not ready to accept Pakistan in this NSG, but India, they don't have much problem. But China is basically putting creating hurdles on the path of India's induction into NSG. Not only this, recently you have seen that when this a terrorist outfit led by Azhar Massoud in Pakistan was being blacklisted by United Nations, when United Nations was keen to declare him as a terrorist, Pakistan again opposed it. So I mean these are the instances in recent years where we find that in spite of this growing engagement, these two countries have certain differences. Particularly, these are considered, these statements, these development, these moves are considered by India as provocative move, because it is nothing related to China. It is basically issue related to Pakistan, but nonetheless, China is creating hurdle. Now, here I would like to mention one thing, that after this Pokhran 2, 98, when Indian Prime Minister wrote a letter to American President and explaining to him in light of the sanctions which were being contemplated or which had already been imposed, that India's nuclear program was not directed towards USA or any such power. Rather, it mentioned China as a nuclear power and as a neighbor, and also India's pending disputes and issues with China. And therefore, it was India's compulsion for security reasons to go nuclear. Now, this letter, it is believed, that got leaked and reached China, and China considered it as an affront that India was basically flexing its muscles or going nuclear to to target China. So that was the issue related to this Pokhran 2. But much developments have taken place since 98, and today in 2017, when we are discussing India-China relationship, many new developments have taken place, and the most important development is, of course, the economic engagement between these two countries. And in this context, we should remember that this proposal of China of one route, one belt policy, one belt, one road policy, as it is called OBOR, that basically includes many countries of South Asia, that includes Russia also, that includes Iran also, that includes Afghanistan also, and it is basically meant to create a kind of communication linkage between east to west. The road is going to pass from east to west as a corridor, economic corridor, or a kind of link which will establish a new economic corridor all over Asia. Now, China wants India to be part of it, but India has some reservations. We will come back to this issue. The reservation is simply this, that in this entire proposal, China is showing certain areas which are basically in India's, from India's point of view, are occupied by Pakistan. that is the area in Kashmir, and therefore India doesn't want to be part of any such proposal or any such move where India's sovereignty is not presented in a proper perspective or proper light. Rather, it is compromised because certain areas which in India's opinion belong to India are shown to be out of India. And apart from that, there are certain other concerns related to it, but this is important move by China today in order to integrate different scattered economies. And it is interesting here to see that some of the South Asian countries have also expressed their keenness to join this, including Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, Nepal is perhaps going to join, and then Afghanistan is a part of it. In fact, Afghanistan wants India to be associated with this and thereby become part of this larger configuration. In fact, Russia is part of it. So therefore, this proposal is there from the from China, but India has a genuine problem with this, though India is not averse to this idea of any economic integration. In fact, India was very quick to support Chinese proposal of Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. In fact, India is also ready to discuss and engage China on number of issues, and recently we have seen that this engagement goes even in security areas. They had a joint naval exercise in Indian Ocean. In fact, on terrorism and many other issues, they exchange notes and they exchange ideas. So therefore, this is one thing. The another dimension is this economy, and here the most important thing is trade. Now today, China has replaced USA as the most, replaced USA as the biggest trading partner of India. In fact, today China happens to be the biggest trading partner. In fact, but interestingly, what happens that in this trade exchange, we find that China normally exports to India primary, the finished goods, manufactured goods, whereas India is exporting only raw materials. And therefore, many economists believe that this trade relationship is reminiscent of the colonial period, when the colonial powers exported to India manufactured goods and India exported only raw materials. So therefore, there is some issue in this trading relationship also. There is some gap, there is some imbalance, there is some deficit, and that has to be covered. There are other proposals from China to integrate northeastern part of India with Myanmar and some other part of China, and this is known as Coming proposal, which happened around 2000, and therefore this is meant to integrate the eastern part of India with certain parts of China and Myanmar and Bangladesh. So this proposal is also there. In fact, India's response has also not been very positive, because India is quite circumspect so far as the security of northeastern states is concerned, because this is to be mentioned here that China's interference in some of the South Asian countries, which are India's neighbors, sometimes does not go down well with India. And therefore, India feels that if India becomes part of such initiative, India's security may get compromised or exposed. But then there are counter arguments also that such proposals are important for economic development of certain regions in India, and so far as this intrusion is concerned, in fact India should take other measures to checkmate it. But instead of shooting it down, such proposals, India should not simply ignore the economic benefit which may accrue from such measures. So these are the things which we can see that are happening very fast in recent decades after 2000. Proposals coming from Chinese side, initiatives being taken by them, and some of the initiatives have been reciprocated by India also. That's why India and China find themselves in forum like BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation and RICS and many other multilateral forum where they negotiate, they discuss, and so on and so forth. Even in this Doha round of WTO, we could see that how China and India were on the same page so far as agriculture subsidies were concerned. Even on many issues related to ecology and environment, we find that India and China speak in the same voice so far as the concerns of developing countries are concerned. But of course, we should also remember that China is not keen for India's membership in Security Council, permanent member in Security Council. China is not keen for India's membership in nuclear supplier group. China is not keen to support India on certain moves which are meant to basically blacklist some of the organizations and groups which in India's opinion are acting against India's interest in Pakistan. So therefore, there are differences there, but there are convergence also. But one important factor which is happening today is this American factor in India-China relationship, because the entire discussion of India-China relationship will remain incomplete unless we also mention this Cold War politics, the kind of triangle which was created between US, China and Pakistan, particularly after 65 India-Pakistan war. And therefore, what we find that this triangle worked in the entire Cold War period. In fact, even after the Cold War period, till recently, when United States has openly started speaking against China's adventurism or China's aspiration in world politics. So this triangle, US-China-Pakistan triangle, was created during Cold War, when India, though as a leader of non-aligned movement, entered into friendship and peace and friendship treaty with Soviet Union and became closer to Soviet Union. On the other hand, we also know that how Sino-Soviet rift happened. In spite of having the same ideological systems, that is socialism, both countries had differences. And therefore, on the one hand you have Sino-Soviet conflict, on the other hand you had US, China and Pakistan triangle. And it was in this context that we found that a new equation was created. On the one hand, USA, China and Pakistan, on the other hand you have Soviet Union and India. Now what has happened after disintegration of Soviet Union? The Soviet Union is no longer a player. Russia is not having the same old relationship with China, what Soviet Union had after that split, and therefore China and Russia are engaged in a number of deals and dialogues, and whether it is RICS or Shanghai Cooperation or in Afghanistan or number of issues, we can see the convergence between Russia and China. And Pakistan, of course, is continuing with Chinese equation, continuing in Chinese equation as an important player. So therefore, now what is the geostrategic result of this new equation which is emerging in this part of the world? Now, one analysis says that with growing interest of Russia in Pakistan, one can foresee a new equation between Russia, Pakistan and China. But in my opinion, that is not going to work, because Russia and India have learned lesson from the past, and they know to honor each other's interest, and the relationship is, one can say that neither has reached that low which we saw after disintegration of Soviet Union in 90s, or we cannot claim that it is on the same footing as it was when Soviet Union was there. But nonetheless, India and Russia are having a mutually agreed engagement and relationship. But so far USA is concerned, USA is an important dimension. For USA, India is today natural ally because of democratic values which are cherished in both countries. And USA also knows that China's ascendancy is a threat to its global status, and therefore how US-India relationship basically results into a kind of equation in Asia where China may consider it as a threat to its interests, but India doesn't basically look at the entire thing in terms of either pro-US or pro-Russia or pro this or pro that. India simply wants to play the international game as per international ethics and international law and international rules. India wants to anchor its relationship with China on its own terms, on basis of their national interests, and doesn't want to play the game of this power or that power so far as Asia and South Asia is concerned. Now, of course, the question which often arises that would China go for 62 type of adventurism? Now, there are many scholars who believe that that is not possible, and in a globalized world where Chinese stake is so high that China cannot afford that type of 62 type adventurism vis-a-vis India, or for that matter any other country, whether USA or any other country, because China wants to gain from this globalization. Rather, China is one of the biggest gainer of this globalization. Therefore, China's stake is high. In China wants to be on the right side of all major economic powers in the world. In fact, Kissinger, one of the very eminent strategic thinker in USA, has recently in a book has mentioned that China's old adventurism is not possible today because of many reasons. The kind of inequality which prevails in China, the kind of regional disparity which one can see in China, and on the other hand, the aspiration for global role. So all these things are forcing China to abandon its old policy and look towards more creative engagement in new world. And that creative engagement, that fulfillment of that aspiration is not possible for China unless it basically anchors its relationship with India on a very strong footing. Though China always fancies for itself a role of a middle kingdom complex and looks at other countries on the periphery and consider itself at the center of this entire circle. But that is fine, but so far as today's situation is concerned, neither China can wish away India's growth, India's success, and India's stature in the world politics, nor India can simply ignore and wish away Chinese presence and Chinese ascendancy on the world politics. So therefore, this engagement is going to be important in the coming years and the coming decades, and therefore 21st century, in fact, though belongs to Asia, but when it comes to Asia, it is the relationship between India and China which is going to play the most important role so far as this entire global politics is concerned.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Jha for coming to our show and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.